All right, so this week we're going to cover grouping and aggregation, and we've kind of hit on this before. So I'm apologies if there's any um, double coverage here, but it'll be good because I like to kind of introduce things beforehand, so that way it's hopefully not a big shock all up front. But really, when we talk about grouping and aggregation, we're talking about changing multiple rows into one. And this will kind of show you a lot of that because like we can do group by and it'll kind of group it. But really grouping comes into play when you want to do an aggregate function, and it's a group by clause is required if you have an aggregate function. And there's many different types of aggregate functions like here. So here's some max returns the maximum value, the min. One of the most popular ones are average, sum, and count. So some good examples, like if we're determining GPA or like an average score per student, average is taking multiple values and getting an average of them. So for example, like those of you in the room here, if I had all your class scores in a database and I did average, I would just want one record for each one of you with your average score. Same thing with sum and count. And you can put all these together in kind of one big query, for example. And this kind of goes into some fine detail that I don't, I'll let you guys read about. But it'll tell you how to, basically the group by clause is going to tell us what do you want to use as the common denominator between these. So essentially, how do we combine these records? And so I'm going to just kind of go through some basic examples here. So let me get logged in here real quick. All right. We're going to use Sequila. All right. So probably always a pretty good example of aggregation is sales. And that's because it's got numbers in it. We like to count things. But we're going to start with something a little bit smaller. And so like I'm going to go under film actor and actor, because what I'm going to do is I want to know which actor has been in the most films. So this is a pretty common problem that you'll come across. So if we describe actor, because we're going to need their names, and describe film actor, these are kind of going to be the two tables that we are going to be working with. So I'm going to pull open a text editor here real quick, so we can use it to write our codes. That way we don't have to make mistakes over and over. All right. So let's start. We're going to just get the actors and what movies they've been in. So we're going to go A dot first name and A dot last name. And I think I have this set up a little better. Let me my text is bigger here. There we go. Let's do that one. Let's do a new script here. We're going to just start fresh. All right, there we go. That's a little better for you to see, I'm sure. So A dot first name and A dot last name from actor. Let's just start there. And we want to make sure, we use Sequila.
Is it the alias?
Yep. Yeah. There we go. All right. So there's our actors. So now we're going to take and we're going to interjoin that with film actor. FA on A dot actor ID is equal to FA dot actor ID. All right. So now we have essentially all the movies that they've been in. Not that we have the movie titles, but we could for example, get the film ID. And we have, so we can see Penelope Guinness has been in quite a few, Nick Wahlberg, so on and so forth. We can see all the different movies they've been in. So now what we want to do is, instead of returning the film ID, we want a count of all the films they've been in, which is essentially the film ID, but we're going to get a count of fa.film ID. Now, if I try to run this just plain, it'll give an error and it'll say in an aggregated query without a group by. So basically it's saying you need a group by clause. So we're going to add that. And now this is where we get to say what we want to group by, or what's the common denominator. And in this case, it's our actor first name and last name. And just as a common rule of thumb, for the most part, the way I like to think about it, because I usually put aggregation at the end, the group by is whatever comes besides your aggregation, really, for the most part. So we're going to say a dot first name. And so most of the time you can just put exactly what your select statement is there, minus the aggregated column. So there now we have a count, and I'm going to make this a little pretty. We're going to say as film count, just to make it a little nicer. So now we can see how many movies each one of these actors have been in, which is kind of neat. And so then if we were saying we want to order it, we want to know we want to order who has been in the most to the least. We could just say order by count fa.film ID. Sending. So it looks like Susan Davis has been in the most with 54. Gina DeGeneres with 42. Walter Torn 41. And it goes down, and it looks like Emily D is the least with 14. So that is an example of how we aggregated, because we've taken multiple rows. And so in fact, let's add a where clause here. So we're going to say where last name, last name is equal to, and let's go Davis. Because basically we're going to take a look here. So we have Susan and Jennifer, and right now there's only 2 records for each of them. Now, if I were to take and comment out everything that makes this an aggregate function, yeah, let's get rid of that too. You can just go here, I guess. You'll notice that we get lots of rows. So what we're really doing is we're taking and we're combining those down into a smaller aggregated result set. And aggregation is just as simple as saying that we are combining multiple things into smaller ones. We're summarizing, which if we use the sum function would very much be appropriate. Now, one thing that I think helps bring it into context, a lot of times, especially in like education, in the world that I deal with, in analytics, aggregation is great to summarize, but the important thing to remember is that anytime you aggregate, you lose detail, because we're taking multiple things and combining them. So for example, a student could have A in math, science, and English, but let's say in social studies they have an F. When we aggregate that, they're going to look like a pretty good student, like a 3.5 student, if we were doing like a GPA type system. But really, there's an F hiding in those results. So aggregation, anytime you do aggregation, you're losing detail, but a lot of times that's aggregation is also extremely powerful, because then you can actually have usable data. So let's take a look at maybe some other examples here. Let's take a look at Max. Max is really handy because we can pull, what I really like to use Max for is to get, for example, we could use Max kind of in a similar situation here, but the thing that I like to use Max for is to find like dates. I think they're really handy for dates. So let's take a look at, I'm going to close you. So let's take a look at rental. If we take a look at rental, we can see that we have this rental date here and a customer ID. So what I want to do is let's get customers and their rentals. We'll select C dot first name, C dot last name from customer. And I like to start pretty simple and then build up from there to make sure everything works. So now let's interjoin that with rental R on C dot customer ID is equal to R dot customer ID. And let's add our R dot rental date. Let's just see what we got here. All right. So here we have all the customers and a rental date. So if we wanted to find a person's last rental, and so like, let's say I come from a really analytical background. And so let's say we want to get the last time a customer rented a movie because we want to find, who are our most frequent customers, or let's send an email out to all the customers who haven't rented a movie in a couple months. Maybe they just need a little reminder to say, hey, rent from us, or marketing type thing. So so we want to get the last time they rented. So we're going to go max r dot rental date. And again, if we try running this, we're going to get that error because we don't have a group by. So we're going to say group by C dot first name. I'm just going to copy that. I'm kind of OCD about formatting, so I apologize. So now we have the max date that every person rented. We could even say as last rental. And then we get the max last rental. And then from there, we could, find all the people that that their last rental was a long time ago, or so on and so forth. All right, let's take a look here. What do you know? They have some of that. Oh, and one thing. So with expressions, like for example, with max, basically here they're returning a function. So basically what they're saying is you can use them like formulas. So in this case, the max date diff. So what is the difference between the return date and the rental date? So who rented, who had the movie the longest, essentially, which is that right there. All right, and this is really important. One thing I wanted to cover is how nulls are handled. So when we perform aggregation, we have to know how nulls are handled, because like, let's say we're running GPAs, we're trying to find out who valedictorian is. And let's say they have a null somewhere in their records, like they didn't get a score for whatever reason, it was an unofficial withdrawal. We want to make sure that doesn't count against them, or we just need to make sure we know how that works, which is really important. So in most cases, null values are excluded, which is good because most of the time that's kind of like what you want. But sometimes it's not always the case, because maybe a null is 0. You know what I mean? So it all just depends on understanding the data you're working with, but knowing how that's going to affect your results. Because if you're pulling an average of sales and 1 month has a null, maybe it is appropriate for it to be ignored, but maybe that really should have been a 0. All right. And I think that's about what we want. Oh, let's talk about a halving real quick. This week's actually going to be pretty light because we've kind of covered this before, and it's really not too complex of a concept, I think, because we're used to doing it a lot. So if we go to, let's take a look at our rental. Actually, we can use the same example. So here's our count of film actors, right? We have, let's get rid of this where clause because we want everybody. Let's say that we want actors who have been in 30 or more movies. Now we can't add a where clause because if I say where the count of fa.film ID is greater than 30. The problem is the where clause runs at a different stage than our aggregation. Because if you remember right, it goes from clause, where clause, and then it goes group by having, which we're going to talk about, and then the select, where the select is where the aggregation occurs with our group by. So instead of doing it this way, so you'll see invalid use of a group function. Instead of doing it that way, we have to, if we want to filter or kind of do a where clause based on an aggregate function, we have to use having. So we say having a count of fa.film ID that is greater than 30. So we want people, and technically let's do greater than or equal to. We want them if they've been in 30 or more movies. So now when we run this, we'll get a cutoff at 30. And we could do it the other way around. Let's say if they've been less than or equal to 30. So now we get everyone below. So the having clause is the where clause of aggregation. So if we want to filter the number, if we want to filter the rows that we have based on aggregation, we have to do a having clause. And the way I like to remember this is because select is the only exception. Really, the query of any statement starts here. So let's where last name is like %D. So if we do this, it starts here from clause, then it does the where clause, then it does group by, having, order, and then the very last thing it does is the select. So I like to think the having has to be aggregation because it has to come after the group by for aggregation to work. But yeah, that's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. The book will cover some of the more minute details of some little things and some different little things, but it should be a pretty light week, really, as far as new concepts. Does anyone have any questions? All righty. Well, like I said, it's going to be a pretty light week, so we'll do a nice short meeting this time. Good luck this week if you're working on your projects. Keep up the good work, and if you have any questions, let me know.
Brother Crook, after you're done with the meeting, could you and I meet for a minute to go over my database?
Yeah, sure. And